Welcome, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today, we're embarking on an incredible journey, a deep dive into the story of a nation truly unlike any other. It's a country woven from, millennia of ancient ties, forged by modern necessity, and constantly navigating these intense currents of complex international dynamics.
That's right. We're zeroing in on Israel, situated right there at the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. And what makes its story particularly compelling, I think, is its unique status in the modern world. It's the only Jewish nation. Its history isn't just a timeline of events. It's packed with dramatic population shifts, unexpected turns, and these continuous geopolitical complexities that really shaped the region as we know it today.
Yeah, absolutely. So, our mission for you today is to truly unpack the core questions surrounding its existence. How did Israel come to be? What were those pivotal, often surprising moments that not only shaped its borders, but also, defined its people? We're going to examine the profound significance of key declarations, the immense, sometimes shocking impact of major conflicts like the Six-Day War, and the continuously evolving experiences of all its inhabitants. And everything we discuss today, every detail is drawn directly from the comprehensive sources you provided, guiding our journey through this often turbulent, always fascinating history. So let's unpack this. So when we begin to consider Israel, I think we absolutely have to start with the land itself, right? For the Jewish people, this isn't just any piece of territory. It's a physical space steeped in history, spiritual significance, and an enduring connection that spans millennia.
And what's truly fascinating here is how this connection dates all the way back to pre-biblical times. It's really quite profound. For Jews, the idea of a homeland in this specific land, coupled with the biblical promise and the longing for a return to the temple in Jerusalem, became absolutely central to their identity. This profound spiritual tether, sustained Jewish identity through nearly 2,000 years of diaspora. Imagine that resilience. A people scattered across the globe after the demise of the Herodian kingdom back in the 1st century CE, yet never fully severing that spiritual link. It's remarkable to think that even by the 1800s, fewer than 25,000 Jews lived there, concentrated mostly in Jerusalem. Yet the yearning for this land remained an incredibly potent force, a powerful undercurrent shaping future events.
That profound sense of identity and belief really comes through in the sources. It's quite striking. And this identity, of course, was tied to a very specific and surprisingly diverse piece of land. Despite its relatively small size, only about 290 miles north to south and maybe 85 miles east to west at its widest point, this country holds an incredibly varied topography.
Precisely. Its geography isn't just a list of features, it's almost like a dynamic character in its story. You have the fertile Mediterranean coastal plain, then the rugged hill regions of northern and central Israel, the stark beauty of the Negev Desert in the south. And running the length of the country along its eastern border, you've got the northern end of the Great Rift Valley, which is a truly significant geological feature. And of course, key water bodies like the Jordan River, Lake Tiberias, which most people know as the Sea of Galilee, and the highly saline Dead Sea, Earth's lowest point, are crucial to its landscape and history.
Right, like the Jordan River forming that natural frontier with Jordan.
Exactly. And this physical stage, this area known broadly as Palestine, had for centuries been under successive Islamic dynasties following the Byzantine period. That lasted until the collapse of the sprawling Ottoman Empire right at the end of World War I.
So, with the Ottomans' weakening grip, the stage was sort of set for new possibilities, right? And even before the British Mandate officially began, there were these early, maybe quiet stirrings of a modern Jewish presence.
Yes, even back in the 1880s, you start to see small but really determined waves of Jewish immigration to Palestine. This wasn't just random migration. It was very much driven by a renewed desire for a Jewish homeland, fueled partly by rising anti-Semitism across Europe, definitely, but also by this powerful, revived sense of Jewish national pride. These early settlers, often from Eastern Europe, established agricultural colonies, sometimes transforming really desolate lands. And they were often financed by prominent philanthropists, notably families like the Rothschilds. This was truly the precursor to the formalized movement we now recognize as political Zionism.
And that's where we meet a pivotal figure, Theodor Herzl. He famously championed the idea of a Jewish state not just as a religious longing, but as a pragmatic political solution, right?
It's exactly a political solution to the enduring problem of anti-Semitism, while also fostering a sort of secular Jewish identity. Herzl's journey to this idea is quite remarkable. He was a journalist covering the sensational Dreyfus affair in France, where a Jewish army captain was falsely accused of treason. And It profoundly shaped his conviction that Jews would never be truly safe or fully integrated without their own sovereign state.
A really formative experience for him, clearly.
Absolutely. His efforts culminated at the First Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, back in August 1897. Now, a Jewish state wasn't immediately achieved, of course, but that Congress laid the crucial organizational groundwork. After Herzl's untimely death in 1904, the work continued under leaders like Chaim Weizmann, who pushed tirelessly to increase the Jewish population in Palestine. And that was a really challenging task under the waning but still present Ottoman rule.
So the early Zionist efforts were clearly gaining momentum, but then came what many historians view as a truly pivotal and incredibly complex moment: the Balfour Declaration. How exactly did Zionists manage to persuade the British government to issue such a weighty declaration in 1917, right in the middle of World War I?
Well, it's a fascinating confluence of strategic interests and, frankly, very effective lobbying. In 1917, Britain was deeply embroiled in World War I, looking for any edge, any support they could get. Zionists, led very skillfully by Weizmann, argued that a Jewish homeland in Palestine could actually serve British imperial interests. Provide a loyal ally in the Middle East, potentially garner support from influential Jewish communities in the United States, and even Russia.
So there was a strategic calculation for the British, too.
Definitely. So the Balfour Declaration, issued by Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour, committed Britain to facilitate the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. This commitment wasn't just a British promise either. It gained international endorsement from the new League of Nations, which then placed Palestine under British mandate. However, and this is where the complexity truly deepens, the sources highlight considerable controversy over conflicting wartime promises to the Arabs and French. Britain had also, through figures like T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, promised self-determination to Arab leaders for their support against the Ottomans.
Right, the famous Arab Revolt.
Exactly. So this single declaration, therefore, didn't just lay a foundation for a Jewish homeland. It simultaneously wove together the dreams of one people with the nascent aspirations of another, setting in motion a profound, almost unavoidable clash of national destinies on the very same piece of land. It's remarkable how a single, carefully worded statement in 1917 became a foundational text for both a nation's birth and, well, a people's enduring grievance.
Okay, so with the Balfour Declaration and the British mandate in place, the path to statehood was, well, it was clearly laid out, but it was far from smooth. Far from it. This period saw a significant increase in Jewish immigration, but it was also a time of really escalating tension and violence.
Absolutely. The local Arab leaders saw the collapse of the Ottoman Empire as their prime opportunity, to create their own independent state or maybe join a larger Arab entity, hoping to revive a glorious old Arab empire. They violently opposed the Zionist goal, seeing it as an external imposition, a foreign intrusion. British efforts to try and foster some kind of cooperative government unfortunately failed completely, just didn't work. This led to what the sources describe as serious disorders escalating into organized violence.
Right.
This widespread unrest culminated in the devastating Arab Revolt of 1936–39, a major uprising against both British rule and Jewish immigration.
And this era also saw the formation of organized Jewish defense forces, which would prove, well, pretty crucial for the nascent state. The Haganah, a clandestine military arm of the Jewish agency, emerged as the largest and most widely representative militia, right? But there were others too.
Indeed. You had groups like the Irgun Zwei Leumi, and its even more violent splinter group, Lehi, often referred to as the Stern Gang. Both of those were affiliated with the ultra-conservative Revisionist Party. And then there was the Palmach, which was an elite striking arm of the Haganah, heavily influenced by a kind of Marxist-socialist ideology. What's truly fascinating here, looking back, is that many of the leaders who would later become prime ministers of Israel, iconic figures like Menachem Begin, Yitzhak Rabin, and Yitzhak Shamir, were all deeply involved in these militias during this formative period.
Wow, so future prime ministers were leading these militias back then.
Yes, it really underscores the formative, often brutal role these groups played in shaping the state's future leadership and its whole approach to defense.
Then came World War II and the unimaginable horrors of the Holocaust, which cast just an immense dark shadow over everything. Britain had initially, perhaps paradoxically, encouraged Jewish immigration in the 1920s. But that policy underwent a drastic and, frankly, tragic change in 1939.
It was a heartbreaking shift, really. Due to the pressures of the Great Depression and this desperate influx of refugees fleeing Nazi Germany, Britain made a severe policy change. They restricted Jewish immigration into Palestine. This was a calculated, if highly controversial, attempt to retain Arab support against the rising threats of Germany and Italy in the run-up to the war. This meant that Palestine, a potential haven, was largely closed off to Jews fleeing Nazi-dominated Europe during World War II, just when they needed it most. After 1945, when the true extent of Jewish losses in Europe became evident, a staggering 6 million, there was this renewed, desperate fervor for Jewish immigration to Palestine.
Understandably.
The Jewish population in Palestine exploded, growing from less than 100,000 in 1919 to around 600,000 by the end of World War II. Simultaneously, though, the Arab population also saw significant growth, increasing from about 440,000 to roughly 1 million by 1940, which just further intensified the demographic and political tensions on the ground.
So with the violence escalating and Britain exhausted by the war and just unable to find a peaceful resolution, they basically turned the incredibly complex problem over to the newly formed United Nations.
And this led to a truly momentous and immediately controversial decision. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly voted to divide British-ruled Palestine into two distinct states, one Jewish and one Arab. This decision, intended to solve the problem, was immediately met with fierce and violent opposition from Arabs across the region. They attacked Jews throughout Palestine as the British slowly withdrew. The fighting quickly became savage, and civilian deaths were tragically high on both sides. Incidents like the killing of about 100 Arab villagers by Irgun commandos in Deir Yassin.
Which was horrific.
Horrific. And the massacre of 77 Hadassah medical convoy members by Palestinian Arabs, these starkly illustrate the brutality of this period and the deep animosity that had taken root.
Amidst this escalating chaos, the Zionist dream was finally realized. Israel declared its independence on May 14, 1948. This was a moment quickly recognized by both the United States and the Soviet Union, interestingly highlighting the emerging Cold War dynamics, along with many other governments. But this declaration was met almost immediately with an invasion.
The very next day, May 15th, armies from 5 Arab states, Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and Transjordan, which is now Jordan, invaded the nascent state. The new state of Israel found itself in truly dire straits. As the sources put it, survival appeared to be at stake. Initially, the Israeli forces were desperately short of arms, training, equipment, pretty much everything. But they were bolstered by incredibly high morale and a unified military command, despite some internal clashes like the bloody Al Palina affair where, Haganah forces under Rabin fired on a ship carrying Irgun supplies and recruits.
Right, tensions even within the Jewish forces.
Exactly. The Arab invaders, meanwhile, while significantly outnumbering the Zionists, critically lacked coordination. This was due to internal rivalries and, frankly, conflicting objectives. For instance, King Abdullah of Jordan had secretly engaged with the Zionists and, somewhat paradoxically, actually opposed the creation of an independent Palestinian state led by his regional rivals.
So they were really up against it initially. Given those immense challenges facing the new state and the sheer scale of the invading forces, what were the critical turning points or unexpected factors that allowed the fledgling Israeli forces to not just survive, but actually turn the tide in that crucial first war?
It really was a precarious balance. During that crucial first month, the small numbers of Israeli forces, fighting literally for their existence, somehow managed to hold off the Egyptian, Iraqi, and Jordanian units. Then a UN ceasefire in June provided a desperately needed respite, allowing the exhausted Israelis to re-equip themselves. This included crucial, if clandestine, aid from Soviet-dominated Czechoslovakia, which was a surprising twist given the Cold War context. Very pragmatic.
Czech arms, yeah, that's often mentioned.
When fierce fighting resumed in July, the Israelis, now better armed and more organized, truly turned the tide. They drove back Egyptian and Iraqi forces in the south and central plain. However, the old walled city of Jerusalem, including the revered Western Wall, was occupied by Jordanian forces. Egyptians held on to the Gaza Strip, and Syrians remained entrenched in the Golan Heights. This was Israel's costliest war, with more than 6,000 killed and 30,000 wounded out of a population of only 780,000, a truly staggering human cost for a young nation.
Just devastating numbers. After such a devastating conflict, what was the immediate aftermath regarding any hopes for peace and, crucially, the massive refugee situation that emerged?
Well, initial UN mediation efforts proved fruitless. Tragically, the Swedish diplomat Count Folke Bernadotte, who was mediating, was murdered by Lehi extremists in September 1948, highlighting the extreme passions involved. When Israel finally secured the armistice agreements in July 1949, the new state found itself controlling about 1/5 more territory than the original UN partition plan had specified. Jordan, for its part, occupied the West Bank, encompassing much of the area originally envisioned for the Palestinian state by the UN. And then there was the immense human tragedy of the Palestinian refugee exodus. More than 600,000 Arab refugees fled their homes, an exodus that began even before May 1948. Some were undeniably forced out by advancing Israeli troops, notably from towns like Lod and Ramla. The Nakba, as Palestinians call it. Precisely. Israel, grappling with its own security fears and the massive influx of Jewish refugees from Arab lands, refused to permit these Palestinian refugees to return. They gathered under UN care in camps in Gaza, the West Bank, southern Lebanon, and Syria. The stark reality, as your sources convey, is that many Palestinians were to stay in these camps indefinitely. The war fundamentally did not bring peace. Arab states overwhelmingly refused to recognize Israel and immediately announced a comprehensive economic and political boycott, setting the stage for decades of ongoing conflict.
Amidst all these immense external and internal challenges, the new state had to rapidly build its infrastructure and absorb its new citizens, particularly under the towering leadership of its first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion. This era was defined by mass immigration and the immense task of integrating these diverse new populations.
The young state faced monumental challenges: securing crucial foreign assistance, devising a coherent defense strategy against openly hostile neighbors, and perhaps most dauntingly, absorbing massive waves of Jewish immigration. This wasn't just a trickle. It included hundreds of thousands of destitute Holocaust survivors, many traumatized and arriving with literally nothing. Alongside them was a large influx of Sephardic Jews from Arab states who felt increasingly insecure and even persecuted after the Arab defeat in 1948.
So a huge wave of people needing homes, jobs, everything.
Exactly. To address this influx, the Knesset, Israel's parliament, passed the Law of Return in 1950, a truly pivotal piece of legislation granting immediate citizenship to any Jew who immigrated. However, this foundational law quickly sparked deeply complex controversies, particularly over the precise legal and religious definition of who is a Jew under Israeli law. This was especially contentious given the Orthodox rabbis' monopoly over religious matters like marriage, divorce, and conversion. This also included the practical challenge of integrating non-Jewish relatives who often arrived with Jewish immigrants.
And within the Jewish population itself, despite the unifying purpose of state building, there were growing divisions based on ethnicity and cultural background, weren't there?
That's right. The Mizrahim, which refers to Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, largely came from urban and traditional societies. They found themselves encountering an Ashkenazic or European Zionist establishment. This establishment was often intent on creating a new, secular Israeli culture, which sometimes clashed with the more traditional Mizrahi communities. Mizrahim were often settled in rural or isolated development towns, rather than existing urban centers, leading to deep resentment against what they saw as a patronizing Ashkenazic elite. This internal division would eventually have a significant impact on the Labor Party's political standing and the broader social fabric of the nation.
And economically, despite the initial optimism, Israel was in a pretty difficult position, emerging from severe austerity.
It was indeed impoverished. They had literally drained their coffers in the War of Independence and the subsequent absorption of immigrants. Its economy only truly began to recover after 1952, and that was primarily thanks to substantial international aid. This came from various sources: generous grants from Jewish charities and bond sales from the global Jewish community, as well as crucial U.S. government assistance. From 1953, Ben-Gurion also controversially secured economic aid from West Germany, a deeply contentious decision, viewed by many, especially members of Menachem Begin's Harit Party, as an abomination given the recent horrors of the Holocaust.
Wow, aid from Germany so soon after the war, that must have been incredibly divisive.
Highly divisive, but it really highlighted the very real economic desperation of the young state.
And despite establishing its borders, the insecurity on those borders didn't really ease up, did it? Arab refugees continued to infiltrate armistice lines, and irregular Arab forces began attacking Israeli villages, farms, roads, trying to make everyday life impossible.
Exactly. Israel's Arab minority, about 1/6 of the population at the time, found themselves caught in a difficult position, kept under military rule in some areas until 1966 due to perceived security risks. The Green Line, that fragile armistice line separating the two sides, was notoriously difficult to defend. Imagine. Jordanian army positions were only 12 miles from the Mediterranean Sea, and the critical road to Jerusalem was within rifle range of Arab sharpshooters. In the period from 1949 to 1953, hundreds of Israelis were killed by these Arab incursions, these infiltrations. In response, from early 1953, Israel shifted its strategy, taking the offensive and escalating retaliations against both guerrillas and regular army units from Jordan and Gaza in a desperate attempt to secure its fledgling borders. These were often quite harsh reprisal raids.
This escalating tension, particularly with Egypt, all built up to the Suez War in 1956.
Yes, the Israeli retaliatory raids, particularly those led by figures like Ariel Sharon, deeply humiliated Gamal Abdel Nasser's Egyptian government. Nasser, a veteran of the 1948 war, viewed Israel as a symbol of foreign aggression and was determined to expel remaining British and French influence from the region. After failing to get American arms, he turned to the Soviet bloc, signing a massive arms deal with Soviet-dominated Czechoslovakia in October 1955. This immediately threatened Israel's military superiority, sparking a serious arms race. Nasser then escalated further, blockading the Strait of Tiran, which cut off Israel's southern port of Eilat, a vital trade route.
Which Israel saw as an act of war.
Precisely. Ben-Gurion, back as prime minister, saw this as an act of war and secretly planned a preemptive attack. This coincided perfectly with Britain and France's desire to regain control of the Suez Canal after Nasser had defiantly nationalized it. So a truly bizarre and secret alliance was formed between Israel, France, and Britain. In October 1956, the IDF, under the command of Moshe Dayan, swiftly broke Egyptian lines in the Sinai. This provided a cynical but effective cover for an Anglo-French invasion of the Canal Zone itself.
So Britain and France thought they could use Israel's war as a kind of pretext to reclaim the Suez Canal. But the U.S. wasn't having it right. Eisenhower stepped in pretty hard.
Precisely. U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower was absolutely infuriated by this duplicity and the blatant violation of international law. He saw it as old-style colonialism. He swiftly and decisively compelled the British and French governments to withdraw their troops, which effectively ended much of their regional influence and signaled the decline of the old European colonial powers. Israel was also forced to withdraw to the old armistice lines, but not without securing crucial concessions. The U.S. agreed to place a UN peacekeeping force, UNEF, in the Sinai. And critically, the U.S. promised that the Strait of Tiran would remain open to Israeli shipping. This arrangement brought nearly a decade of unprecedented calm to Israel's southern border. However, it also undeniably sparked a dangerous regional arms race. Israel, despite a continuing U.S. arms embargo, obtained advanced weaponry from France, including the Dimona nuclear reactor and Mirage jets, and indirectly from the U.S. via West Germany. Under the leadership of IDF Chief of Staff Yitzhak Rabin, the military became an increasingly professional and formidable organization, preparing really for the next inevitable conflict.
So after nearly a decade of relative calm on the southern front, which was a significant achievement in itself, tensions began to escalate again. What forces were gathering and how did they coalesce to plunge the young nation into what would become another defining and truly transformative conflict, the Six-Day War of 1967?
Well, while the southern border was relatively quiet, the Jordanian and Syrian borders were anything but. In May 1967, increasingly violent clashes with Palestinian guerrillas and Syrian army forces along Lake Tiberias, the Sea of Galilee, spiraled into a general regional crisis. The Soviet Union, always a player in the region, falsely alleged that Israel was mobilizing to attack Syria. This wasn't actually true, but it raised the temperature significantly. Syria, in turn, publicly chided Nasser for his perceived inaction and, well, just rhetoric. Under this immense pressure from the Arab world, Nasser felt compelled to act. He mobilized his own forces into the Sinai, imperiously ordered the UN peacekeeping forces to withdraw the very forces keeping the peace over, and then, most provocatively, announced a blockade of the Strait of Tiran, once again cutting off Israel's access to the Red Sea. This was seen by Israel as a direct casus belli, an act of war.
And the encirclement became complete.
Yes, this encirclement was completed when King Hussein of Jordan, surprisingly perhaps, joined the Arab War coalition, placing Israel in an incredibly vulnerable, almost existential position, surrounded on all sides.
So Israel was completely surrounded, facing an existential threat. What was their urgent response to this unprecedented encirclement?
Prime Minister Levi Eshkol mobilized the entire IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, and sent his foreign minister, Abba Eban, on what turned out to be a futile trip to seek international aid and diplomatic intervention. Nobody was really helping. The pressure was immense. After Rabin, who was then IDF Chief of Staff, suffered a temporary breakdown from sheer exhaustion, the coalition parties compelled Eshkol to appoint the legendary Moshe Dayan as defense minister. They also formed a national unity government, a crucial move which notably included the opposition leader Menachem Begin, uniting the political spectrum in a moment of dire national peril. The very next day, June 5th, Israel launched a devastating preemptive strike, a daring, coordinated aerial assault that decimated the Egyptian Air Force on the ground before it could even get off the tarmac. This was the opening salvo of the Six-Day War.
That decisive first strike really set the tone for what truly became a lightning-fast conflict. How did Israel manage such a swift and comprehensive victory?
Indeed, it was a total rout of Egyptian, Jordanian, and Syrian forces in an astonishingly short 6 days. Israeli troops with superior training, strategy, and frankly, higher morale, captured huge quantities of arms and took many thousands of prisoners. By June 10th, Israeli troops stood victorious along the Suez Canal, on the banks of the Jordan River, and atop the Golan Heights. But perhaps most significant and certainly most emotional to everyone involved, Israel captured the remaining sections of Jerusalem not already under its control, including the ancient Old City and the revered Western Wall, reuniting the city under Israeli rule for the first time in centuries. This victory wasn't just military, it was profoundly symbolic and religious.
This was clearly a massive military triumph, completely reshaping the map of the Middle East, but it also brought a whole new set of complex realities and profound complications for Israel itself. A troubled victory, perhaps.
Absolutely. That's a good way to put it. The victory dramatically expanded Israel's control over significant new territories. The entire Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and East Jerusalem. This expansion, however, immediately meant that over 1 million additional Palestinians in these newly occupied territories were now under Israeli military rule, which posed immense demographic, administrative, and frankly ethical challenges for Israel moving forward. Militarily, the vastly extended front lines along the Suez Canal, Golan Heights, and Jordan River severely strained Israel's small standing army, requiring constant vigilance and a much larger defense budget.
And internationally, there was significant backlash and scrutiny of this expansion, wasn't there?
Yes, there was strong international opposition to the expansion of Israeli control, especially the unilateral absorption or annexation of the Old City of Jerusalem. French President Charles de Gaulle, protesting Israel's surprise attack, immediately imposed an arms embargo. This was a significant blow to Israel's Air Force, which had relied heavily on French Mirage jets. This situation, a major diplomatic crisis, was eventually resolved when the United States, recognizing Israel's new strategic importance in the Cold War context, began supplying Israel with Phantom fighter jets to replace the French planes. This really solidified a crucial long-term defense relationship between the U.S. and Israel.
So after such a sweeping military victory, the immediate question must have been, how do you translate this military triumph into a lasting peace? Was there an effort?
That quest began immediately, but it was fraught with difficulty. Prime Minister Eshkol's secret offer to trade much of the newly won territory for peace agreements was unequivocally rejected by Nasser and other Arab leaders at the Khartoum Arab Summit in August 1967. There, Arab leaders famously articulated the three no's: no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. This set a very hard line. In November 1967, the UN Security Council responded by passing the crucial Resolution 242. It demanded Israeli withdrawal from occupied territories and recognition of secure borders for all states in the region.
Okay, so Resolution 242, what was the key part there? That wording seems really important.
The crucial nuance here, often debated endlessly, was the specific wording in the English version. Withdrawal from occupied territories, rather than withdrawal from all the occupied territories. Some argued this intentionally left crucial room for negotiation on the final borders, allowing for potential territorial adjustments in a peace deal. However, for Palestinians, the resolution was deeply unsatisfying. They were mentioned only as refugees, presumed to be represented by Jordan, completely sidelining their own national aspirations.
Right, no mention of Palestinian statehood or self-determination. So with these vast new territories under occupation, what was Israel's initial policy regarding settlements and the daily life of Palestinians under this new Israeli control?
Initially, Defense Minister Moshe Dayan implemented what was famously called a light-handed occupation policy. The goal was to hold the territories with minimum overt force, relying mainly on air power for deterrence. The Israelis remarkably left the Temple Mount, or Haram al-Sharif, under the administration of the Islamic Waqf. They also left local Arab institutions and even Jordanian and Egyptian legal codes largely in place in the West Bank and Gaza, respectively. Over the next decades, an interesting, if complex, economic link developed between Israel and the occupied territories. The underemployed Arab workforce in the territories gravitated towards Israeli industries, construction, agriculture, services. Over 150,000 workers eventually commuted daily, creating a significant, though unequal, economic interdependency.
But Israel also began to establish a more permanent presence in these new territories, which some critics saw as the start of a quiet, maybe not so quiet colonization.
That's a crucial point, and yes, that language is often used, though the sources here focus on the actions themselves. Israel did indeed begin a strategic process of establishing a presence. The Israeli government moved to reclaim areas that had been settled by Jews before 1948 and lost in the war, like the SEM bloc in the West Bank. Beyond that, Yigal Allon, a prominent labor politician, devised a plan known as the Allon Plan. This was specifically designed to settle Jews in strategic areas of the West Bank, Gaza, Sinai, and the Golan Heights, primarily for security reasons, creating defensive lines. However, it's worth noting that by 1977, excluding East Jerusalem, only about 5,000 Israelis lived in these strategic settlements, indicating a relatively slow initial pace under labor governments. More significantly, Israel unilaterally enlarged the municipal boundaries of Jerusalem and developed large new Jewish neighborhoods with state subsidies, often on expropriated land. The stated aim was to establish a clear Jewish majority in the unified capital. The historic Jewish quarter in the Old City was also meticulously reconstructed.
And then you have this settlement movement really taking off, particularly the religious settlers.
Yes, alongside the government plans, a new, powerful religious movement, Gush Emunim, meaning block of believers, emerged after the '67 war. Guided by Rabbi Zvi Yehuda Kook, these religious Zionists believed passionately that settlement everywhere in biblical Israel, what they called Judea and Samaria, would hasten the Messianic era. They actively established settlements, like the one in the heart of Hebron in 1968, often pushing beyond government-sanctioned areas, driven by ideology rather than just security strategy.
So despite the light-handed approach in some areas, there was a clear strategic and ideological drive for settlement. And this period wasn't entirely calm, was it? This led to what became known as the War of Attrition.
Exactly. In early 1969, Egypt, under Nasser, began what it termed the War of Attrition against Israel along the Suez Canal. This was a deliberate attempt to inflict heavy losses, wear Israel down, and force it to withdraw from the Sinai. They used heavy artillery bombardments, new MiG aircraft supplied by the Soviets, Soviet advisors on the ground, and advanced SAM surface-to-air missiles. These attacks inflicted heavy losses on Israeli forces stationed along the canal, the so-called Bar-Lev line. Golda Meir, who became prime minister after Eshkol's death, retaliated forcefully with massive air raids deep into Egypt. These were only suspended when Soviet pilots themselves began flying combat patrols over Egypt, signaling a very dangerous escalation and direct Soviet involvement.
Wow, Soviet pilots in combat. That's serious.
Very serious. Simultaneously, Yasser Arafat's Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, which had regrouped after 1967, launched guerrilla raids into Israel from its new base in Jordan. These often targeted non-military civilian targets. Israel quickly stamped the PLO as a terrorist organization and crucially refused to negotiate with them, setting a precedent that would last for decades.
This sounds like an incredibly precarious situation, risking direct confrontation with the Soviet Union, something President Nixon would want to avoid at all costs. How did the U.S. respond to de-escalate this?
President Richard Nixon indeed feared a direct confrontation with Moscow. The Cold War context was everything. He instructed his Secretary of State, William Rogers, to intervene with a complex ceasefire proposal known as the Rogers Plan. This proposal, surprisingly perhaps, was accepted by Israel, Egypt, and Jordan in August 1970. However, the Egyptians and Soviets almost immediately violated the agreement by moving missiles closer to the canal under the cover of the ceasefire. In Jordan, King Hussein's acceptance of the ceasefire ignited savage fighting between the Jordanian army and the now powerful PLO militias within Jordan itself. This led to a period known famously as Black September. Syria even sent tanks into Jordan to aid the Palestinians, escalating it into a regional mini-war. But coordinated Israeli, American, and Jordanian military moves decisively defeated the Syrians and, critically, expelled the PLO from Jordan. Arafat and his forces were forced to seek refuge in Lebanon, tragically shifting the focus of conflict and instability there.
And what was the long-term outcome of this war of attrition? It seems like a pivotal yet often overlooked conflict.
Well, Meir's strategy had succeeded in one key aspect. Israel's willingness to risk confrontation and its effective military response definitely strengthened its strategic relations with the United States, cementing that critical alliance. King Hussein's regaining control in Jordan demoralized Palestinian resistance within his borders and, for a time, secured Israel's eastern border. When Nasser died shortly after the conflict, his successor, Anwar Sadat, did not immediately renew the fighting, leading to a period of relative, if tense, calm along the Suez Canal. However, the broader regional arms race continued, fueled by both superpowers, and the PLO's relocation to Lebanon unfortunately set the stage for future instability and conflict in that country. This conflict, though less known than the Six-Day War, really hardened Israel's resolve and its strategic alignment with the West.
Despite the relative calm that followed the war of attrition, true peace remained elusive. The region was soon plunged into another major conflict, the Yom Kippur War of 1973. This was a massive shock for Israel, wasn't it? Coming on the holiest day of the Jewish calendar.
It was indeed a profound shock. On October 6, 1973, which was Yom Kippur, the holiest day in Judaism, Egypt and Syria launched a devastating, meticulously coordinated surprise attack. They hit Israeli forces stationed along the Suez Canal and the Golan Heights simultaneously. Israeli confidence, perhaps bordering on complacency after the 67 victory, in their early warning systems and air superiority was gravely misplaced. They were caught completely off guard. Egyptian missiles, particularly new Soviet-supplied anti-aircraft and anti-tank systems, inflicted a heavy, shocking toll on Israeli warplanes and armored units in the initial hours and days. The sheer intensity of the combined assault quickly exhausted Israel's reserve munitions, leaving them in a truly desperate situation.
So, with Israel, what was the response and how did they manage to turn the tide?
Prime Minister Golda Meir, in a moment of extreme crisis, urgently appealed to the United States for aid. President Nixon, recognizing the immense geopolitical stakes, especially with the Soviet Union pouring supplies into Egypt and Syria, swiftly established an emergency airlift supply line to Israel. This was done despite Arab nations imposing a costly oil embargo on the West and some American allies refusing to even allow U.S. planes to refuel on their territory.
A huge political risk for Nixon.
Absolutely. These crucial reinforcements, often arriving just in time, were a lifeline. With these, the IDF rapidly turned the tide, though at great cost. General Ariel Sharon, known for his daring and sometimes controversial tactics, led a crucial counterattack, crossing the Suez Canal and threatening the Egyptian Third Army, virtually encircling them. On the Golan Heights, Israeli troops, fighting with incredible courage and suffering heavy losses, managed to repulse the Syrians and even advance towards Damascus, threatening the Syrian capital itself. At that critical juncture, the United States, deeply alarmed by Soviet threats of direct military intervention if Israel continued its advance, the superpowers were on high alert, secured a ceasefire, effectively ending the most dangerous phase of the conflict.
The war clearly had profound political and social repercussions for Israel, extending far beyond the battlefield. It shook the nation to its core, didn't it?
Absolutely. The initial failures, the intelligence breakdown, the heavy losses, it led to deep public outcry and soul-searching. Golda Meir's government resigned in April 1974, deeply discredited by the war's initial setbacks, even though they ultimately won militarily. However, the Labour Party narrowly won the subsequent election, and Yitzhak Rabin, a hero of the 1967 war and former ambassador to Washington, became the first native-born Israeli prime minister. A new generation taking charge. Rabin advocated a strategy of trading space for time, essentially exchanging territorial concessions, particularly in the Sinai, for peace and security arrangements, and stressed closely coordinating with Washington. He reached a second disengagement agreement with Egypt in September 1975, facilitated by the intensive shuttle diplomacy of U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger.
Kissinger's famous shuttle diplomacy, yeah.
Meanwhile, at the Rabat Arab Summit in October 1974, in a move that significantly complicated Israel's preferred Jordanian option for negotiations over the West Bank, the PLO was declared the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. This was a big win for Arafat. In response, Kissinger provided secret assurances to Rabin that the U.S. would not recognize the PLO unless it ceased terrorism and explicitly recognized Israel's right to exist, a key American commitment. At the same time, the Gush Emunim settlement movement gained significant force after the Yom Kippur War. They felt the near disaster proved the need to hold on to biblical lands. They began planting small, often unauthorized communities near large Arab populations in the West Bank. By 1977, these nascent settlements numbered nearly 4,000 settlers, significantly complicating any future policy on the territories and serving as a constant physical reminder of the competing claims to the land.
So, after decades of labor dominance in Israeli politics, the landscape shifted dramatically in 1977 with the rise of Menachem Begin and the Likud party. This marked a truly historic political earthquake, right?
To the surprise of many observers, yes. Menachem Begin's Likud party won the May 1977 election, marking the first time a non-labor government was formed in Israel's history. A huge change. Begin's victory was largely fueled by deep-seated Sephardic resentment against the labor establishment. Many Sephardim or Mizrahim felt that the primarily European-origin Ashkenazic elite of the Labor Party had treated non-European Jewish immigrants as second-class citizens for decades. Begin, coming from the revisionist Zionist tradition founded by Jabotinsky, strongly opposed territorial compromise on the West Bank. He viewed it not as occupied territory, but as integral biblical Israel, Samaria, and Judea. He passionately argued that UN Resolution 242 did not explicitly require withdrawal from this area, leaving room for his interpretation that it applied only to the Sinai. He immediately began an extensive settlement program in these areas, overseen by his staunch ally Ariel Sharon, dramatically accelerating the pace of Jewish construction in the West Bank.
But then, amidst this new political reality, a truly historic and almost unfathomable moment occurred. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat's courageous visit to Israel. How did that come about, and what was its immediate impact?
It was utterly unprecedented, just astonishing. Frustrated by stalled diplomacy after the 1975 agreement and the seemingly intractable conflict, Sadat, in a truly bold and unexpected move, surprised the entire world. He flew to Israel in November 1977 and addressed the Knesset, Israel's parliament. Imagine the symbolism. The leader of Israel's fiercest Arab adversary standing on Israeli soil, speaking directly to its elected representatives. While direct agreement wasn't immediately reached, Begin was tough. This courageous act shattered psychological barriers and opened the door for direct, high-level negotiations. The faltering Egyptian-Israeli talks were finally rescued when U.S. President Jimmy Carter, leveraging his diplomatic prowess and personal commitment, convened a landmark summit at Camp David in September 1978.
Camp David, that was a real turning point, wasn't it? Out of that intense, secluded summit came the famous Camp David Accords, a true breakthrough in Middle East peace efforts.
The Camp David Accords established a vital framework for a comprehensive peace based on Resolution 242. They actually had two parts. One was a framework for peace between Egypt and Israel. The other offered Begin's concept of autonomy for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. 5 years of limited self-government, which would then be followed by final status talks between Israel and a Jordanian-Palestinian team. This groundbreaking effort, a testament to the leader's willingness to take immense risks for peace, Sadat especially earned Sadat and Begin a Nobel Peace Prize. The Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty was then formally signed on the White House lawn on March 26, 1979.
And what were the main terms of that treaty?
It called for a 3-year phased Israeli withdrawal from the entire Sinai Peninsula, right back to the international border. It established limited force zones on both sides of the new border, the placement of a multinational observer force, MFO, to monitor compliance, and the establishment of full diplomatic relations, ambassadors, tourism, the works between the two former enemies. The U.S. provided significant financial and military aid to both countries as part of the agreement, reinforcing its role as a key regional mediator and guarantor. Israel, honoring its commitment, undertook the painful process of evacuating its Sinai settlements, like Yamat, sometimes involving the forced removal of resistant settlers by the Israeli army itself, a very traumatic internal moment.
But this cold peace with Egypt, while monumental, didn't immediately translate to broader regional acceptance or halt all other tensions. It seems the conflicts just shifted elsewhere, almost intensified in some ways.
Far from it. Syria, Iraq, and the PLO were absolutely outraged by Egypt's separate peace, viewing it as a betrayal of the Arab cause and pan-Arab solidarity. They immediately suspended Egypt from the Arab League and severed all diplomatic ties. Egypt was isolated in the Arab world. Jordan and the Palestinians, feeling sidelined and pressured by the rejectionist states, refused to engage in the proposed autonomy talks outlined at Camp David. That part of the Accords basically went nowhere. And on the ground, Begin continued building new Jewish settlements in the West Bank and Gaza at an accelerated pace, further complicating any future land for peace negotiations with Palestinians or Jordan. Meanwhile, the devastating civil war in Lebanon escalated, and the PLO, now firmly established there, used it as a launching pad for increasingly frequent raids and rocket attacks on Israel's northern border communities. In a separate, daring, and highly controversial act in June 1981, Israel destroyed Iraq's Osiak nuclear reactor near Baghdad, fearing Saddam Hussein's potential to develop nuclear weapons. Preemptive strike doctrine in action.
Right, the Osiak raid, highly controversial internationally.
Very. And then, when Sadat was tragically assassinated in October 1981 by Islamist extremists opposed to the peace treaty, his successor, Hosni Mubarak, maintained the formal peace treaty, the Cold Peace, but the broader hopes for warm relations, trade, tourism, and cultural exchange between Egypt and Israel never truly materialized.
This ongoing cycle of violence and the escalating PLO presence in Lebanon ultimately led to the major Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, a war that would prove deeply divisive within Israel itself.
Begin was determined to finally defeat the PLO, which had established a kind of state within a state in southern Lebanon after being expelled from Jordan. They were using it as a base for relentless terror attacks into northern Israel. After a PLO splinter group attempted to assassinate Israel's ambassador to Britain, Shlomo Argov, and the PLO retaliated to Israeli bombing with rocket fire into Israel, Begin ordered a new, large-scale invasion in June 1982, codenamed Operation Peace for Galilee. The cabinet initially authorized a limited operation aimed at creating a 25-mile security zone to push PLO artillery out of range. But Ariel Sharon, then defense minister, had far more ambitious plans. His forces advanced swiftly and aggressively far beyond the authorized limit, pushing all the way towards Beirut, the Lebanese capital. Israeli jets engaged and destroyed Syrian anti-aircraft missiles in the Bekaa Valley and engaged in ground skirmishes and aerial combat with Syrian forces. Israeli troops ultimately besieged Arafat and his PLO units in West Beirut. After weeks of heavy fighting and bombardment, they were eventually evacuated by sea under the supervision of a multinational peacekeeping force, including U.S. Marines.
And tragically, this war also led to the horrific Sabra and Shatila massacres, a dark stain on the conflict and on Israel's image.
Yes, a truly awful chapter. In September 1982, after the PLO had been evacuated from Beirut, Israeli forces, who controlled the area around the camps, allowed the Phalangist militia, a Christian Lebanese paramilitary group allied with Israel but hostile to the Palestinians, into the Palestinian refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila. The stated reason was to clear out remaining PLO fighters. What followed was an horrific atrocity. The Phalangists systematically massacred hundreds, perhaps thousands, of unarmed Palestinian men, women, and children over several days. Sharon, as defense minister, was later condemned for negligence by an official Israeli commission of inquiry, the Kahan Commission, which found him indirectly responsible for not anticipating or preventing the massacre. He was forced to resign as defense minister. This tragedy, combined with the war's increasing human and financial cost, and the sense that the war aims had become unclear, deeply divided Israeli society. Massive peace protests took place in Tel Aviv. President Reagan then presented his own peace plan, attempting to revive the Palestinian track, but it was rejected by both the Arab states and Begin's government. Begin, reportedly devastated by the war's outcome, the controversy, and personal tragedy, including the recent death of his wife, resigned abruptly in 1983. The Hezbollah attack on U.S. Marine headquarters in Beirut in October 1983, killing 241 American servicemen who were part of the multinational force, ultimately led to the U.S. withdrawal of forces from Lebanon, further highlighting the volatile and complex nature of the region and the limits of external intervention.
Following the turmoil of the Lebanon War and Begin's resignation, Israel entered a period under a national unity government. This was a fascinating time of political maneuvering and, crucially, continued settlement expansion in the West Bank.
Yes, the 1984 election resulted in a near tie between Labor and Likud, neither able to form a government alone. To stabilize the economy, which was suffering from hyperinflation partly due to war spending, and to extricate Israel from the costly morass in Lebanon, Labor and Likud formed a genuinely unusual national unity government. Shimon Peres, the Labor leader, served as prime minister for the first 25 months, then rotated the premiership with Likud leader Yitzhak Shamir. Yitzhak Rabin served as defense minister for both, providing continuity. Under this shared leadership, Israelis began a phased withdrawal from most of Lebanon in June 1985. Though they maintained a self-declared security zone in the south, collaborating with the local militia, the South Lebanon Army. Crucially, assisted by significant U.S. loan guarantees conditioned on reform, a comprehensive economic recovery plan was initiated. This began the process of reforming Israel's largely state and Histadrut, the powerful labor federation, controlled economy, moving towards a more market-oriented system. Austerity measures were tough, but they did curb inflation. However, even within this unity government, Shamir, particularly when he was prime minister, continued Begin's policy of actively settling Jews throughout the West Bank, aiming to create irreversible facts on the ground and isolate Arab towns. Ariel Sharon, serving as housing minister under Shamir, heavily subsidized these new residential communities, leading to the Jewish population of the West Bank and Gaza, excluding East Jerusalem, approaching 100,000 by 1992, significantly changing the demographics and making a two-state solution physically harder to implement.
And it was against this complex backdrop of expanding settlements, growing Palestinian frustration under occupation, and persistent diplomatic stalemate that the First Intifada, or shaking off, erupted in 1987. This was a truly organic, grassroots uprising, wasn't it?
Yes, it really was. The First Intifada wasn't planned or orchestrated by the PLO leadership. who were still mostly in Tunis. It was a cumulative explosion, a spontaneous eruption, caused by a toxic combination of factors. The relentless effects of settlement expansion encroaching on Palestinian land, the daily friction and bureaucratic control of Israeli military rule, land seizures, severe economic stagnation in the territories, and the crushing weight of the diplomatic stalemate which offered absolutely no hope of political resolution. It was characterized not by organized armies, but by widespread street violence demonstrations, commercial strikes, stone throwing. Famously, children and teenagers battling heavily armed Israeli troops with rocks and stones became the enduring image, often captured by global media.
So the spontaneous uprising, how did the Israeli military react?
They were caught completely by surprise. They were trained for conventional warfare, not policing a civilian population engaged in mass protest. They were ill-equipped, both tactically and morally, to handle this type of civilian uprising, leading to what the sources call a grinding contest of wills, and, tragically, many civilian casualties, mostly Palestinian. Israel's international image suffered significantly from the raw, unedited media images circulating globally of Israeli soldiers using harsh measures, including beatings against young Palestinians. Economically, frequent closures of areas imposed by the army severely disrupted the Palestinian economy, and Israel, facing a shortage of Palestinian labor due to the unrest and closures, began replacing Arab day labor with newly arriving immigrant workers, particularly from the former Soviet Union. This period, surprisingly, also proved to be a turning point for the PLO. Under pressure from the Intifada happening on the ground and nudged by the U.S. and others, Arafat, speaking at a UN meeting moved to Geneva in December 1988, publicly recognized Israel's right to exist and explicitly suspended terrorism. This was a pivotal shift in PLO policy. This led the U.S., under the outgoing Reagan administration, to finally, for the first time, formally recognize the PLO and open a direct dialogue.
Then came the Gulf War in 1990, which temporarily overshadowed the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but, quite unexpectedly, also paved the way for new diplomatic opportunities in its aftermath.
Exactly. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in August 1990, he tried to link the occupation of Kuwait to the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories, attempting to rally Arab support by stirring up antagonism against Israel. He even launched dozens of Scud missile attacks on Israeli cities like Tel Aviv and Haifa, prompting widespread fear and forcing Israelis into sealed rooms with gas masks. The U.S., leading an international coalition to liberate Kuwait, strongly urged Israel not to retaliate, fearing that an Israeli military response would fracture the fragile anti-Iraq coalition, which included several Arab states, by turning it into an Arab-Israeli conflict. Israel, under Prime Minister Shamir, remarkably held its fire, despite the provocation. This decision significantly strengthened its relationship with Washington. The coalition swiftly and decisively devastated Iraq's military. A key consequence of this war was that the wealthy Persian Gulf states, infuriated by Arafat's perceived endorsement of Saddam, cut off their substantial financial support for the PLO, plunging it into a severe financial crisis.
So Arafat backed the wrong horse there, and it cost the PLO dearly.
Immensely. Iraq's defeat and the concurrent decline and eventual collapse of the Soviet Union fundamentally altered the geopolitical landscape. This finally opened the diplomatic door. U.S. Secretary of State James Baker seized the moment, leveraging America's enhanced influence, convening the Madrid Peace Conference in October 1991. This marked the first direct, face-to-face official talks between Israel and its Arab neighbors, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and a joint Jordanian-Palestinian delegation since Camp David. It aimed for comprehensive peace treaties on bilateral tracks, alongside multilateral talks on regional issues like water and refugees, and importantly, interim Palestinian self-government for the West Bank and Gaza. However, the talks ultimately stalled. The Palestinians continued to demand immediate discussion of statehood. Shamir's government continued to expand settlements during the talks, and the U.S. openly contested those settlements, withholding loan guarantees, creating friction between Washington and Jerusalem.
This stalemate, despite the new diplomatic opening, ultimately led to another significant shift in Israeli politics, with Yitzhak Rabin's election in 1992 and the secretive, almost bizarre Oslo Accords that seemed to come out of nowhere.
It did seem that way publicly. Rabin, the former general and war hero, returned to power, campaigning on a platform of both security and flexibility. He promised less spending on settlements inessential for security and a renewed effort towards peace, particularly with the Palestinians. He won a narrow advantage for the Labor Party. Once in office, Rabin immediately initiated a partial freeze on settlement construction, mainly halting new government planning but allowing existing projects to continue, partly to mend relations with the new Clinton administration in the U.S. The settler population still grew significantly during this time, reaching about 135,000 by 1992. Critically and completely outside the official Madrid-Washington track, his foreign minister, Shimon Peres, nurtured secret, unofficial negotiations with PLO officials through Norwegian diplomatic channels. Academics and Peres' aides met PLO figures in Oslo. These backdoor discussions, away from the glare of official delegations and hardline positions, proved far more flexible and pragmatic. Rabinowitz, known for his deep caution and security focus, initially skeptical, eventually decided to gamble on Arafat's ability to deliver peace from the Palestinian side. He saw a potential partner he could work with, albeit reluctantly. Arafat, for his part, was facing that severe financial shortage due to the loss of Gulf state funding and growing challenges from Islamic militant groups like Hamas, which was gaining ground during the Intifada. He desperately needed a political win and agreed to the concept of interim autonomy as a foothold in Palestine, hoping it would lead to eventual statehood. He was willing to take a massive risk for peace.
And this truly unprecedented secret negotiation led to the historic Declaration of Principles, a moment that captured the world's imagination with that handshake on the White House lawn.
It's September 1993, yes, a surreal and profoundly symbolic event unfolded on the White House lawn. Israel and the PLO formally signed the Declaration of Principles on Palestinian Self-Rule, often referred to simply as Oslo, where's Clinton presiding, Rabin and Arafat shaking hands. This was the first ever direct agreement between the two sides who had been locked in bitter conflict for decades. It endorsed a 5-year interim period of self-rule for a newly formed Palestinian Authority in parts of the West Bank and Gaza. Crucially, highly sensitive final status talks on core issues like borders, refugees, the status of Jerusalem, and settlements were all reserved for later, to be negotiated within that 5-year time frame. Under the agreement, the PLO explicitly recognized Israel's right to exist in peace and security and formally renounced terrorism and violence. Israel, in a truly momentous step, recognized the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. The Cairo Agreement in May 1994 then enacted these provisions for the Gaza Strip and the West Bank town of Jericho first, beginning the process of Israeli troop withdrawal from those populated areas.
So what was the basic exchange here? What did each side get?
Well, essentially, Israel shed the immense administrative and security burden of directly ruling the Palestinian population centers while retaining overall strategic control over the territories, borders, airspace, and settlements, Area C. Palestinians, for their part, gained self-government in the cities and towns, Area A, and the potential for a future state, plus the return of Arafat and the PLO leadership to Gaza and Jericho. Israel also gained a crucial security partner in theory, with the PLO pledging to fight terrorism with its own newly established Palestinian police force. And Palestinians stood to benefit significantly from promised foreign aid and new economic agreements with Israel designed to boost their economy.
And following that groundbreaking agreement, Jordan also signed a comprehensive peace treaty, further transforming the regional landscape.
Yes. In October 1994, Jordan, led by King Hussein, signed a truly comprehensive peace treaty with Israel, normalizing relations, settling border disputes, agreeing on water-sharing arrangements, and opening up economic cooperation. This move, following the Oslo Accords, began to break down long-standing taboos, and other Arab states cautiously began to discard their strict boycotts and engage in more open, albeit often low-level, contact with the Jewish state, particularly Gulf states. However, despite these historic breakthroughs, the Oslo Accords faced significant challenges and fierce opposition from both sides almost immediately.
Not everyone was happy about Oslo, were they? Especially Hamas, who continued their violent opposition.
That's a critical point. The Islamic group Hamas and other smaller militant factions like Islamic Jihad violently opposed the Oslo Accords, viewing them as a betrayal of the Palestinian cause and a sellout by Arafat. They launched a horrific series of terror attacks on Israeli civilians between 1993 and 1997, killing scores in suicide bombings on buses and in public places. These were deliberately aimed at undermining the peace process and shaking Israeli public confidence in Rabin and Peres. Rabin retaliated with security measures, including border closures, preventing thousands of Palestinian workers from commuting to jobs in Israel, which further deepened economic hardship in the territories and fueled resentment. And sadly, there were also acts of extreme violence from the Israeli side, such as the horrific massacre of 29 Arabs praying in the Cave of the Patriarchs in Hebron by an extremist Israeli settler, Baruch Goldstein, in February 1994. This sparked widespread Palestinian outrage and riots. Israel continued its anti-terrorism efforts, often assassinating Hamas leaders. Arafat, however, in a move that deeply frustrated and angered Israel, sought to co-opt rather than fully repress Hamas. He saw them as a political rival, but also a necessary component of Palestinian politics that needed to be managed not crushed. This difference in approach to Hamas became a major point of friction.
Despite these immense challenges and the violence, the peace diplomacy seemed to paradoxically fuel a remarkable economic boom in Israel during this period. How did that work?
It truly did seem paradoxical. Austerity measures in the 1980s had already begun to streamline the economy. But the real catalysts in the early 90s were the massive influx of highly skilled immigrants, particularly engineers and scientists from the former Soviet Union following its collapse. This coincided perfectly with Israel's burgeoning and highly competitive high-technology sector, which was taking off. Its strategic proximity to the European market also helped boost exports. From 1990-95, Israel's economic growth exploded, exceeding 5% annually, unemployment was cut in half, and inflation dropped dramatically to single digits. Foreign investment poured in, especially into tech startups. Exports to Asia surged, and the decades-long Arab boycott began to visibly ease, opening new markets, particularly in the Gulf. By 1996, Israel's gross national product surpassed that of Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon combined, and its per capita income began to approach European standards, significantly reducing its reliance on U.S. economic aid. It was a remarkable period of prosperity amidst the political turmoil.
Then, in September 1995, we saw another significant agreement, Oslo II, which went into much greater detail about the West Bank itself.
Yes, Oslo II, formerly known as the Interim Agreement on the West Bank and Gaza Strip, was a far more detailed and complex document than Oslo I. It essentially laid out the mechanics of Palestinian self-rule in the West Bank. It set a precise schedule for phased Israeli withdrawals from Palestinian population centers, the major cities like Nablus, Ramallah, Bethlehem, etc., and it created that complex system of territorial zones. Area A, under full Palestinian security and civil control, mainly cities. Area B, under Palestinian civil authority but joint Israeli-Palestinian security control, villages and rural areas. And Area C, under exclusive Israeli civil and security control, which comprised over 60% of the West Bank and included all Israeli settlements and critical infrastructure like roads. It also set the stage for the first ever elections for the President and Council of the Palestinian Authority, which were meant to legitimize the new governing body. However, the very ratification of Oslo II by only one vote in the Knesset signaled a significant loss of political support for Rabin. Many Israelis were becoming increasingly skeptical, angered by Arafat's inconsistent cooperation on security matters and the continued Hamas attacks. The religious Sephardic Shah's party left the coalition over disagreements about religious funding, forcing Rabin to rely on Israeli Arab Knesset members for his majority, a politically charged alliance that his opponents attacked fiercely.
And tragically, this entire period culminated in the shocking assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. That must have changed everything.
Yes. A defining tragic moment. Shortly after Oslo II was passed, Rabin, recognizing the deep divisions within Israeli society over the peace process, embarked on a public campaign to rally support. Following one such large rally for peace in Tel Aviv in November 1995, attended by tens of thousands, he was tragically assassinated by a right-wing Jewish religious fanatic, Yigal Amir. Amir opposed the peace process, saw Rabin as a traitor for ceding biblical land, and believed he was acting on religious grounds. Israelis were absolutely horrified and deeply shaken. After a funeral attended by many international leaders, including some Arab representatives like King Hussein and President Mubarak, there was a profound outpouring of national grief and, initially, a surge of public support for the peace process Rabin had championed. Shimon Peres, Rabin's longtime partner and rival, took over as prime minister and proceeded with the implementation of Oslo II. By early 1996, Israeli troops had withdrawn from most major Palestinian cities in the West Bank, and most Palestinians found themselves under varying degrees of self-rule, though Israel still controlled the majority of the territory, Area C, and all external borders. Arafat, in a landmark election overseen by international observers, easily won as the first president of the Palestinian Authority in January 1996, solidifying his leadership, but also inheriting the immense challenges of building a state under occupation and amidst ongoing conflict.
So after the tragic assassination of Rabin, Israel's political landscape shifted yet again, with Benjamin Netanyahu becoming prime minister in 1996. This marked a period where the peace process often stalled, defined by a very different, much tougher approach.
That's right. Peres, despite the initial surge of sympathy after Rabin's death, lost narrowly to Netanyahu in the May 1996 election. That defeat was attributed partly to a series of devastating Hamas suicide attacks in the lead-up to the election that profoundly angered and frightened Israelis, undermining confidence in Peres and the Oslo process. Netanyahu, the first Israeli prime minister born after the state's founding in 1948, campaigned on peace with security and promised a much tougher stance on Arafat. He insisted on Palestinian reciprocity, meaning Palestinians had to fully fulfill their security obligations under Oslo before Israel made any further withdrawals or concessions. His cabinet was a fractured coalition, reflecting a changing political map where both Labor and Likud lost ground to smaller, often more ideological parties. These included religious blocs like Shas and the National Religious Party and the new Yisrael B'aliyah Party, representing the large wave of recent Russian immigrants. Netanyahu was initially very reluctant to even meet Arafat and immediately raised doubts about planned withdrawals from the West Bank city of Hebron, creating a palpable sense of distrust right from the start.
And this approach quickly led to a significant crisis in Jerusalem in 1996, igniting widespread protests and violence.
Indeed. Israel's decision to open an exit to an ancient archaeological tunnel running alongside the Western Wall complex in September 1996, a move intended mainly to improve tourist access, ignited furious Palestinian fears. Arafat and Palestinian leaders claimed it threatened the foundations of the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound above, one of Islam's holiest sites. Violent protests erupted throughout the West Bank and Gaza. In a dangerous escalation, Palestinian police, armed as part of the Oslo Accords, actually fired on Israeli soldiers, resulting in dozens of deaths on both sides over several days of clashes. President Clinton was forced to convene an emergency summit in Washington to de-escalate the situation. Afterward, Netanyahu reluctantly pledged to accelerate negotiations for an agreement on Hebron, which was finally reached in January 1997, leading to a partial Israeli withdrawal from most of the city, though a heavy Israeli military presence remained around the Jewish enclaves.
But the friction didn't end there. There were withdrawal disputes and continued settlement construction.
No, the peace process remained deeply troubled. Israel's subsequent decision to begin construction of a large new Jewish neighborhood, Har Homa, on contested land in East Jerusalem, effectively cutting off Arab villages south of Jerusalem from the rest of the West Bank, led to even more protests and violence. Arafat, in turn, responded by releasing some Hamas activists from Palestinian jails and suspending security cooperation with Israel, further unraveling the fragile agreement. Netanyahu's proposal to skip further interim withdrawals and jump straight to final status talks was rejected by both Arafat and the U.S., highlighting the deep chasm that had opened and the complete lack of trust.
This persistent impasse ultimately prompted further U.S. intervention, leading to the Wye River Memorandum in late 1998.
Yes, in October 1998, with the peace process teetering on the brink of collapse, the U.S., under President Clinton, who was deeply invested in Oslo, intervened again, brokering intense negotiations at the Wye River plantation in Maryland. This resulted in the Wye River Memorandum. This complex agreement explicitly linked further phased Israeli withdrawals from parts of the West Bank, Area B and C, to specific, verifiable Palestinian actions on security, things like publicly renouncing anti-Israel provisions in the PLO Charter, confiscating illegal weapons, and cracking down on militants. It also significantly enlarged the U.S. role, involving the CIA in monitoring implementation, a sign of the deep distrust between the parties. The memorandum promised to put roughly 2/5 of the West Bank under partial or total Palestinian control eventually. However, Netanyahu faced growing political troubles at home, a recession caused partly by high interest rates aimed at cutting earlier inflation, rising unemployment, and a reduced government budget. His right-wing coalition partners were also unhappy with the Wye Agreement's withdrawal commitments. Facing rebellion in his coalition, he called early elections for early 1999 and unilaterally suspended implementation of the Wye Agreement, effectively ending his first term amid considerable acrimony.
This set the stage for Ehud Barak's election in 1999. He was another labor leader, a former general, who aimed for rapid progress on the peace front, hoping to capitalize on what he saw as a fleeting window of opportunity.
Barak, Israel's most decorated soldier, won decisively over Netanyahu in May 1999, campaigning on a promise of renewed peace efforts and economic growth. He sensed an urgency, believing there was a narrow window for a breakthrough. Syrian President Hafez al-Assad was known to be in declining health, and President Clinton was nearing the end of his term and eager for a legacy-defining peace deal. Barak aimed for definitive talks on the final status of territories, borders, Jerusalem, refugees before carrying out further major withdrawals, a different approach from Oslo's incrementalism. But this rigid approach faced resistance from Palestinians who wanted withdrawals first. A new interim agreement, sometimes called Wye II, was signed in September 1999, leading to some minor withdrawals, but critical deadlines weren't met and trust remained low. Barak then focused intensely on the Syrian track, Negotiations took place in late 1999 and early 2000, but ultimately stalled over Syria's insistent demand for a full Israeli withdrawal to the pre-1967 borders, which included a small strip of shoreline on Lake Tiberias, the Sea of Galilee, something Iraq felt was strategically unacceptable. Frustrated with the lack of progress on the Syrian front and fulfilling a campaign promise, Barak eventually withdrew Israeli troops unilaterally from the security zone in southern Lebanon in May 2000, ending an 18-year occupation without an agreement with Syria or Lebanon. This was done to a UN-demarcated border, the Blue Line.
And then, in a dramatic last-ditch effort, President Clinton convened the Camp David summit in July 2000, hoping to achieve a final, comprehensive Israeli-Palestinian agreement. This was supposed to be the big one.
This summit was indeed seen as a critical make-or-break moment. Clinton brought Barak and Arafat together at the presidential retreat for intense, prolonged negotiations over 2 weeks. Barak, according to most accounts, made what he and the Americans believed were unprecedented Israeli offers on territory, offering over 90% of the West Bank with land swaps, Jerusalem, proposing shared sovereignty or administration in parts, and even a limited return of refugees to Israel proper. But Arafat, crucially, refused to compromise on core Palestinian demands, particularly full sovereignty in East Jerusalem, including the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif, and on the right of return for millions of Palestinian refugees to Israel itself, not just the future Palestinian state. He felt Barak's offers didn't go far enough or guarantee Palestinian contiguity. He returned home from Camp David empty-handed, but to widespread Palestinian and Arab acclaim for having stood firm, having in essence said no to both Israel and the U.S. on these core issues. For Israelis, however, this failure and the subsequent outbreak of intense violence, what became known as the Aqsa Intifada or the Second Intifada, were devastating.
Right, the Second Intifada. That erupted shortly after Camp David failed.
Yes, following a provocative visit by opposition leader Ariel Sharon to the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif complex in September 2000, surrounded by heavy security. Rioting erupted, quickly spreading throughout the West Bank, Gaza, and even among Arab citizens within Israel. Violence rapidly escalated, becoming far deadlier than the First Intifada, involving suicide bombings, shootings, and heavy Israeli military responses. Hundreds were killed by spring 2001, predominantly Palestinians. International efforts to restore calm failed repeatedly. This tragic turn of events, the collapse of Camp David and the outbreak of intense violence, convinced most Israelis, including many who had supported Oslo, that Arafat was not a reliable partner for peace. This sentiment led directly to Barak's decisive defeat by Ariel Sharon, the very man whose visit helped ignite the Intifada in a special prime ministerial election in February 2001.
Moving forward to the mid-2000s, Ariel Sharon, now prime minister, took a surprising, almost paradoxical turn himself with his disengagement plan, pulling out of Gaza. And we saw the emergence of a new centrist party, Kadima.
It was indeed surprising, given Sharon's history as the father of the settlements. In late 2003, Sharon announced a unilateral disengagement plan. The plan was to withdraw all Israeli soldiers and settlers, about 8,000 settlers from the Gaza Strip, and 4 small, isolated settlements in the north and West Bank. This controversial plan, which deeply divided his own Likud party and Israeli society, was driven by demographic concerns and a belief that holding Gaza was strategically untenable. It was completed, often forcibly removing settlers, in September 2005. Following a debilitating stroke in January 2006 from which he never recovered, Sharon fell into a coma. Ehud Olmert, his deputy, became acting prime minister and leader of Sharon's newly formed centrist party, Kadima, meaning forward, which Sharon had created after splitting from Likud over the disengagement. However, new uncertainties immediately arose. Hamas, the Islamist militant group that opposed peace with Israel, won an unexpected landslide victory in the Palestinian parliamentary elections in January 2006. This led to an international boycott of the Hamas-led government, and subsequently, Hamas violently taking over the Gaza Strip from the Fatah-led Palestinian Authority in a brief but brutal internal conflict in June 2007. Israel, along with many international actors, recognized the Fatah-led administration of the West Bank, based in Ramallah, as the legitimate Palestinian government. They declared the Hamas-led Gaza Strip a hostile entity and imposed a severe land, air, and sea blockade, severely restricting imports and exports, which continues in various forms to this day.
This situation inevitably led to further cycles of conflict in Gaza and, separately, a difficult war with Hezbollah in Lebanon in 2006.
Indeed. Hamas rocket attacks from Gaza into southern Israel continued sporadically, prompting strong Israeli retaliatory airstrikes and incursions. A truce brokered by Egypt in June 2008 collapsed in December, leading to a large-scale Israeli offensive, Operation Cast Lead, involving massive airstrikes followed by a ground campaign aimed at stopping rocket fire and weakening Hamas. This conflict resulted in over 1,000 Palestinians killed, many civilians, and tens of thousands left homeless, drawing significant international criticism. Unilateral ceasefires were eventually declared by both sides in January 2009. Concurrently, the abduction of 2 Israeli soldiers by Hezbollah across the Lebanese border in mid-2006 sparked a controversial 34-day war in Lebanon. Israel launched a massive air campaign and ground invasion aimed at freeing the soldiers and degrading Hezbollah's capabilities. However, Israel failed to achieve its main objectives. The soldiers weren't freed. Their bodies were returned later in a prisoner swap, and Hezbollah emerged politically strengthened despite significant damage to its infrastructure in southern Lebanon. Over 1,000 Lebanese, mostly civilians, and more than 150 Israelis, mostly soldiers, were killed. The war drew both domestic criticism in Israel for its handling and international reproach for the scale of destruction in Lebanon. Olmert's standing, already damaged by the Lebanon War, was further weakened by multiple corruption allegations, leading to his resignation as Kadima leader in 2008. He remained caretaker PM until the early 2009 elections.
This brings us to Benjamin Netanyahu's second stint as prime minister, which began in 2009 and lasted for over a decade, a remarkably long tenure. This period was marked by a consistently stalled peace process and continued regional instability.
Netanyahu formed a largely right-wing government after the February 2009 election, beating a long, often tumultuous period in power. His tenure faced significant international criticism early on, notably in May 2010 after the Mavi Marmara incident. Israeli naval commandos raided a flotilla of civilian ships trying to break the Gaza blockade in international waters. A violent confrontation occurred on the lead ship, the Mavi Marmara, resulting in the deaths of 9 Turkish activists after they attacked the commandos. This led Turkey, a former strategic ally, to expel Israel's ambassador and suspend military agreements, causing a major diplomatic rupture. Regional instability from the Arab Spring further complicated matters. Hosni Mubarak's sudden deposal in Egypt in 2011 initially soured relations, especially after Israeli forces mistakenly killed 5 Egyptian police officers near the border during a pursuit of militants in August 2011. This led to popular outrage in Egypt and the storming of the Israeli embassy in Cairo.
Domestically, there were also significant socioeconomic protests during this time that really highlighted internal tensions within Israel.
Yes. In the summer of 2011, unprecedented social justice protests erupted, starting with tent camps on Tel Aviv's Rothschild Boulevard. Initially sparked by the high cost of housing, the protests quickly expanded to wider concerns about social and economic inequality, the power of oligarchs, and the cost of living. Over 400,000 people participated in a day of protest across Israel in September, a massive mobilization reflecting widespread middle-class discontent. A recurring political issue throughout Netanyahu's terms was the controversial conscription of Haredi or ultra-Orthodox Jews into the military. They were traditionally exempt to allow full-time religious study, but court rulings demanded more equal burden sharing. This issue, deeply dividing secular and religious segments of society, repeatedly threatened his coalition's stability, particularly in 2012, highlighting the complex and often fraught relationship between religion and state in Israel.
And what about the peace process with the Palestinians during this long period under Netanyahu? Did it advance at all or just completely freeze?
It largely came to a near-complete halt. Netanyahu and Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas rarely met for direct, substantive talks. Abbas persistently demanded a complete freeze on Israeli settlement construction in the West Bank and East Jerusalem as a precondition for resuming negotiations. Although Netanyahu did implement a 10-month partial freeze on new West Bank settlement housing starts in late 2009 under U.S. pressure, it controversially didn't include East Jerusalem or public buildings, and talks quickly stalled again after it expired. In December 2017, the Trump administration made a truly pivotal and highly controversial move, formally recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital, breaking with decades of U.S. policy and international consensus. The U.S. embassy was later moved there from Tel Aviv. This significantly intensified tensions and led the Palestinian Authority to effectively boycott the Trump administration, viewing the U.S. as no longer a fair and impartial mediator. The subsequent Trump administration peace plan, unveiled in 2020, heavily favored Israeli positions and was well received by Netanyahu, but overwhelmingly discouraged and rejected by Palestinians. Israel formulated plans for annexing parts of the West Bank, largely based on the Trump plan's map, but later suspended these plans as part of the historic normalization agreements, the Abraham Accords, brokered by the U.S. with the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. These accords further sidelined the Palestinian issue on the regional agenda.
The Palestinians, frustrated by the stalled peace process, also sought unilateral statehood recognition at the UN, taking their case directly to the international body. How did that play out?
Yes, facing diplomatic deadlock, Abbas pursued international recognition. In September 2011, he formally requested UN Security Council recognition for Palestinian independence as a full UN member state. Israel vehemently opposed this, arguing that statehood could only be achieved through direct negotiations. The U.S., aligning with Israel, signaled it would veto the resolution, so it never came to a vote. However, in November 2012, Abbas sought a less ambitious but still symbolically significant upgrade to non-member observer state status from the UN General Assembly, where there is no veto. This passed with a significant majority. 138 nations in favor, only 9 opposed, including Israel and the U.S., and 41 abstentions. This upgraded status allowed Palestinians to join international treaties and organizations, including controversially the International Criminal Court, ICC, in 2015, a move strongly opposed by Israel and the U.S., who feared politically motivated investigations. Israel argued this unilateral move would further hinder direct talks.
And the cycle of conflict in Gaza tragically continued to flare up throughout this period multiple times.
Absolutely. It became a grimly recurring pattern. Beginning November 14, 2012, Israel launched a major air offensive in Gaza, codenamed Operation Pillar of Defense, following increased rocket fire. The operation began with the targeted killing of Hamas's military chief, Ahmed Jabari. Hamas retaliated with more intensive rocket attacks, some reaching Tel Aviv and Jerusalem for the first time, thanks to longer-range missiles. After 8 days of intense conflict, an Egyptian-brokered ceasefire was reached on November 21st. Another, much larger and deadlier, crisis erupted in the summer of 2014. It was triggered by the abduction and murder of 3 Israeli teenagers hitchhiking in the West Bank in June. Netanyahu immediately blamed Hamas. After the boys were tragically found dead, a wave of public anger in Israel led to violent anti-Arab protests, and horrifically, the revenge kidnapping and murder of a Palestinian teenager from East Jerusalem by Jewish extremists. Rocket attacks by Gaza militants resumed daily, escalating sharply. On July 8, 2014, Israel launched a massive military operation, Operation Protective Edge, initially with aerial and naval bombardment, and then deploying ground forces into Gaza with the stated aim of destroying Hamas's extensive network of cross-border attack tunnels. After nearly 2 months of intense fighting, involving heavy urban combat and widespread destruction in Gaza, an open-ended ceasefire was reached in late August. The terms were similar to 2012, promising an easing of the blockade and extending Gaza's fishing zone, though implementation remained disputed. This was one of the deadliest conflicts in years. Around 70 Israelis, mostly soldiers, and over 2,100 Palestinians, a majority civilians, according to UN figures, were killed. Stark reminder of the enduring human cost. Tensions flared again significantly in 2018, starting with large-scale Palestinian protests along the Gaza border fence, the Great March of Return, which were often met with violent Israeli responses, resulting in numerous deaths and injuries. This escalated periodically into exchanges of airstrikes and rocket fire. Following a botched, covert Israeli operation inside Gaza was exposed in November 2018, Hamas fired hundreds of rockets into Israel. Netanyahu ultimately agreed to a truce, restoring relative calm. This decision led to his hardline defense minister, Avigdor Lieberman, resigning in protest, precipitating a government crisis and highlighting the political fault lines within Israel over how to deal with Gaza.
So the challenges weren't just external with Gaza and the Palestinians. Internal Israeli politics also saw significant, often turbulent changes during Netanyahu's long tenures. So many elections.
The cost of living remained a major domestic issue, as seen in those large-scale tent protests back in 2011 demanding socioeconomic equality. The conscription of Haredi Jews became a recurring political flashpoint. The Supreme Court struck down exemptions multiple times, demanding legislation for more equal service, but drafting such legislation repeatedly threatened Netanyahu's ruling coalitions, which often relied on Haredi parties. This created deep societal friction between secular, religious Zionist, and Haredi communities. The inability to pass a state budget in 2012 due to coalition disputes over austerity and the Haredi draft led to early elections in January 2013. These elections saw a surprising centrist surge with Yair Lapid's new Yesh Atid party, campaigning strongly on middle-class socioeconomic concerns and ending Haredi exemptions, getting the second largest number of seats. Netanyahu, adapting, formed a more centrist coalition, including Yesh Atid and Tzipi Livni's Hatnua party, excluding the Haredi parties for the first time in years. However, in late 2014, after firing Lapid and Livni over policy disagreements, Netanyahu called early elections again for March 2015. This time, fearing defeat, he rallied his right-wing base and ultimately formed a narrow but more stable right-wing coalition, bringing the Haredi parties back in.
And Netanyahu also faced unprecedented legal challenges during this time, with serious corruption charges.
Yes. Starting around 2017, police investigated Netanyahu in several corruption cases.
In 2018, they recommended criminal charges. In February 2019, the Attorney General formally announced his intent to indict Netanyahu for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust in 3 separate cases, pending a hearing. Netanyahu vehemently denied all wrongdoing, calling the investigations a politically motivated witch hunt by the media and legal establishment. This legal cloud, combined with persistent political turmoil, including Lieberman's resignation over the Gaza ceasefire in late 2018, which cost the coalition its majority, and the ongoing failure to pass a Hurdy draft law acceptable to the courts, ultimately led to his coalition dissolving. Early elections were called for April 2019. This election, in 2 subsequent rounds in September 2019 and March 2020, resulted in unprecedented political deadlock. Neither Netanyahu's right-wing religious bloc nor a center-left bloc led by Benny Gantz, a popular former IDF chief of staff heading the new centrist blue and white list, could form a stable majority government. Lieberman, heading a secular nationalist party, became a kingmaker, but refused to sit with either Haredi parties or Arab parties, insisting on a national unity government which failed to materialize. Policing issues, particularly claims of ethnic bias against Ethiopian Israelis after police killings sparked protests, and concerns about inadequate law enforcement and rising crime rates in Palestinian communities within Israel also became prominent public concerns during this period, highlighting internal societal divisions.
And then, as if the political landscape wasn't tumultuous enough, the COVID-19 pandemic hit in early 2020, adding another layer of crisis and uncertainty.
Israel's initial COVID-19 response in the spring of 2020 was swift, strict, involving lockdowns and border closures, and seemed effective in containing the first wave. However, subsequent waves hit harder, attributed partly to poor preparedness for reopening, inconsistent enforcement, and political infighting within the emergency unity government formed between Netanyahu and Gantz after the March 2020 election, a government specifically created to handle the pandemic, but plagued by distrust. Budget wrangling between Netanyahu and Gantz, linked to their power-sharing agreement and Netanyahu's ongoing trial, led to the automatic dissolution of the Knesset in late 2020 when they failed to pass a budget. This triggered new elections yet again for March 2021, the 4th national election in just 2 years. Israel was widely hailed internationally for its remarkably swift and efficient COVID-19 vaccination campaign in early 2021, securing large quantities of Pfizer vaccines early on. Though it also faced criticism from human rights groups and the UN for not extending its vaccination program comprehensively to Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and Gaza, arguing it was the Palestinian Authority's responsibility under Oslo, a stance contested under international law regarding occupying powers. Netanyahu, ever the political strategist, actively courted Palestinian citizens of Israel, promising significant investment in their communities and a surprising attempt to potentially gain their support, or at least neutrality, to form a coalition after the March 2021 election. However, coalition talks remained incredibly difficult and deadlocked. Tensions in Jerusalem then escalated sharply in April-May 2021. This was driven by several factors: restrictions on gatherings at the Damascus Gate during Ramadan, limitations on access to Al-Aqsa Mosque due to vaccination requirements, when less than 1% of West Bank Palestinians were fully vaccinated, and a contentious pending Supreme Court ruling on the potential eviction of several Palestinian families from their homes in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of East Jerusalem in favor of Jewish settler groups. Clashes between Palestinians and Israeli police at Al-Aqsa and street violence between Jewish and Arab mobs within Israeli cities erupted. Hamas then launched a barrage of rockets from Gaza towards Jerusalem and other Israeli cities. Israel retaliated with heavy airstrikes on Gaza. This quickly escalated into the most intense conflict since 2014, involving widespread aerial bombardment, rocket fire, and civil unrest within Israel. But unusually, it ended relatively quickly with an Egyptian-brokered ceasefire after 11 days, perhaps showcasing a mutual desire by both Israel and Hamas to contain the conflict from spiraling completely out of control.
Finally, in a truly remarkable political development after 4 inconclusive elections, we saw the formation of the Bennett-Lapid government in June 2021. This was an incredibly unusual coalition that managed, against all odds, to unseat Netanyahu after his record-long tenure.
This was an extraordinary coalition, perhaps unique in Israeli history. It united 8 parties from across the Israeli political spectrum, from the right-wing nationalist Yamina party, led by Naftali Bennett, to centrist parties like Yesh Atid, led by Yair Lapid, to left-wing parties like Labor and Meretz. And crucially, for the first time ever, it included an independent Arab party, the conservative Islamist United Arab List, Ramam, led by Mansour Abbas, as a full coalition member. Bennett, despite leading a small party, became prime minister first under a rotation agreement, with Lapid set to take over after 2 years. Their main uniting goal was simply to remove Netanyahu from power. Bennett faced immense challenges maneuvering the conflicting interests within his ideologically diverse change government. This included a heated dispute early on over a new unauthorized settlement outpost, Aviatar, though he eventually reached a compromise agreement for its voluntary vacating with potential state sanction later. He did, however, oversee the advancement of crucial legislation for a significant multi-billion-dollar investment plan aimed at improving infrastructure and fighting crime in Arab communities, a key demand for Round's participation. And perhaps most significantly, the coalition successfully passed the first state budget in over 3 years, covering 2021 and 2022, ending years of political paralysis caused by the repeated election cycles. However, the government faced relentless criticism and pressure from the right-wing opposition, led by Netanyahu and Likud, who portrayed it as illegitimate and dangerous due to its reliance on RAM. This constant pressure eventually led to the defection of a member of Bennett's own party, Idit Silman, in April 2022, ostensibly over the issue of allowing leavened foodstuffs, chametz, into hospitals during Passover, citing a desire for a government preserving Israel's Jewish identity. This cost the coalition its slim majority.
And then, as the coalition faltered and lost its majority, Lapid stepped in as caretaker PM ahead of yet another election. What characterized his brief tenure, and what were the broader political shifts happening in Israel leading up to the late 2022 vote?
Lapid took over as caretaker prime minister in June 2022 after Bennett and Lapid jointly decided to dissolve the Knesset and call new elections for November 2022, recognizing the government was no longer viable. The dissolution automatically extended an emergency regulation applying Israeli law to settlers on the West Bank, avoiding a potential legal crisis. Lapid immediately demonstrated a strong, assertive leadership style on the international stage. He launched a brief, targeted military operation, Operation Breaking Dawn, in Gaza in August 2022 against Islamic Jihad militants separate from Hamas. He took a consistently hard line against Iran's nuclear program in international forums. And notably, in a speech at the UN General Assembly, he publicly reiterated his support for a two-state solution, a stance that diverged somewhat from Bennett and signaled a more centrist foreign policy approach. He also publicly hailed Palestinian citizens as integral to Israeli society. A tentative, complex U.S.-brokered deal with Lebanon regarding maritime borders and natural gas extraction rights in the Mediterranean was also announced under his leadership, though its finalization remained uncertain. As the November 2022 elections approached, polls showed a significant surge for the far-right religious Zionism bloc, led jointly by the ultranationalist Bezalel Smotrich and the extremist Itamar Ben-Gvir. They appealed effectively to segments of the public concerned about personal security following waves of Palestinian attacks, perceived erosion of Israel's Jewish identity, and deep distrust of the judiciary. They fiercely opposed any coalition involving Palestinian citizens' parties. Smotrich also presented a radical plan for judicial overhaul, seeking to bring the judiciary under much greater legislative purview, significantly weakening judicial review and making it harder to prosecute ministers or disqualify candidates like Ben-Gvir, who had past convictions for incitement. This party became the third largest in the Knesset in the October 2022 election. Netanyahu's Likud, combined with religious Zionism and the Haredi parties, secured a clear and stable right-wing majority, fundamentally reshaping the political landscape once again and paving the way for Netanyahu's return to power at the head of what many saw as the most right-wing government in Israel's history.
So as we looked at Israeli society today, beyond the intense political shifts and external conflicts, what are some of the key internal dynamics shaping it? It sounds like a country constantly grappling with its very identity.
At the beginning of the 21st century, yes, Israel is indeed grappling with both perennial and new problems. The relationship between religion and state continues to be a central, often contentious issue. How does a modern democratic state integrate its profound Jewish identity? There are significant ongoing pressures, particularly from secular and non-Orthodox Israelis, to reduce the Orthodox religious establishment's monopoly over matters like marriage, divorce, conversion, and kashrut supervision. There's a push for more recognition of non-Orthodox streams of Judaism, Reform and Conservative, and for civil marriage options. The question of who is a Jew also remains complex and politically charged, particularly in light of the significant non-Jewish immigration, mainly family members, who arrived with over 1 million immigrants from Russia and other former Soviet states since 1990. An estimated 250,000 or more of these immigrants are not considered Jewish, according to halakha, Jewish law, complicating issues of citizenship, identity, and religious status.
And how are the country's diverse minority groups navigating this evolving identity and asserting their rights?
Sizable minority groups continue to assert their rights and demand full equality. Palestinian citizens of Israel, now comprising over 20% of the population, have increased their electoral strength and political assertiveness, focusing on issues like fighting crime and violence within their communities, securing equitable state investment, and challenging discriminatory laws and practices. The Druze community, who are Arabic-speaking but have a distinct religion and have traditionally been loyal to the state, serving in the military, mobilized strongly against the controversial 2018 Basic Law that enshrined Israel as the nation-state of the Jewish people, arguing it relegated them to second-class status despite their contributions. Ethiopian Israelis continue to face issues of racism and discrimination, protesting against police brutality and asserting that they are sometimes not fully accepted as truly Jewish by parts of the religious establishment or broader society. These internal societal fissures remain significant challenges.
Finally, how has Israel transformed economically and militarily to face its current complex challenges?
Economically, there's been a gradual but profound shift over the past few decades from a largely socialist, state-dominated economy with significant government and historical control, towards a much more competitive, globalized market system, driven heavily by its successful high-tech sector. Many kibbutzim, the iconic collective agricultural communes, have undergone privatization or shifted from agriculture to light industry, tourism, and high-tech ventures to adapt to this new economic reality. Major state-owned enterprises and conglomerates like core industries have undergone massive restructuring, often becoming private entities focused on global markets. Militarily, the IDF, long a core unifying social institution and a symbol of national defense, the People's Army, must now adapt constantly to counter complex and evolving dangers. These include Iran's nuclear ambitions and regional influence, the instability spilling over from the Syrian civil war, sophisticated rocket threats from Hezbollah and Hamas, and the changing nature of cyber warfare and asymmetric conflict. It's transforming into a more technical, technologically advanced, intelligence-driven, and perhaps less universally manpower-intensive force, although conscription remains a cornerstone. Despite all these internal and external challenges, Israel boasts formidable strengths. A large, highly educated, highly trained, and innovative workforce, a dynamic and world-leading technical sector often dubbed Silicon Wadi, a high per capita GNP that rivals many developed European nations, an unparalleled historical record of successfully absorbing massive waves of diverse immigrants, and of course a powerful, experienced, and highly professional army. All these make it a robust and resilient, if intensely complex and often deeply divided nation. #outro.
We've truly journeyed through the incredibly complex origins of Israel today. From those ancient aspirations for a homeland that spanned millennia, right through to its dramatic, often violent birth as a modern state. We've seen how pivotal moments like the Balfour Declaration didn't just lay foundations, but, perhaps inadvertently, set the stage for profound future conflicts by making conflicting promises. And how the Six-Day War, while a stunning military victory for Israel, fundamentally transformed the region's dynamics, bringing millions of Palestinians under Israeli rule and creating new, seemingly intractable challenges.
And beyond these grand geopolitical shifts, we've also touched on the immense societal transformations inside Israel, the absorption of immigrants, the economic shifts from socialism to high-tech, the vibrant but often fractious democracy, and of course the ongoing, often elusive, search for security and peace amidst recurrent conflicts, waves of violence like the Intifadas, and those evolving internal dynamics between secular and religious, Ashkenazi and Mizrahi, Jewish and Arab citizens. It's a story of incredible resilience, innovation, yes, but also persistent tension and unresolved questions.
This deep dive truly reveals that Israel's history is not just a straightforward sequence of events, is it? It's a continuous, often paradoxical, and deeply interwoven interplay of deeply held beliefs, powerful geopolitical forces, and the constantly evolving lives of its incredibly diverse populations. As we've explored the detailed story within these sources, you might be left contemplating. Given the deeply intertwined histories and populations locked together on this small piece of land, what could a truly shared, peaceful future look like? It's a question that continues to resonate decades on, and one that remains profoundly worth pondering.